And good morning, everybody. We are live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. Another week of food safety, food quality, fantastic products for people who are out there enjoying them probably right now as we speak. So, as we like to say here on the chat, in quality and food safety, a lot of times our work goes unrecognized and all the hard things that we do. So, if nobody else says it, Melissa and I are going to say this to you today, which is good job. You did a good job this week. So you've earned your weekend and hopefully you'll have a good one. But in the meantime, welcome to the Food Safety Chat. And if you're new to the show, my name is Bryan Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group. And every week I bring an expert in food safety and quality assurance and career development onto the chat. And we have a discussion. And what's really cool about this is you'll notice this is not a presentation. This is us interacting with you and answering your questions and sharing information, because food safety is not a point of competition. We're all in this together, and the more we can share information, the better off we're going to be. And I am, oh my goodness, I am so excited about our guest today, Melissa Calicchia. How are you doing today?
Good, I'm doing well. Thank you, Bryan.
Yeah, and so let's see. So I had to write down your title because there's lots of stuff going on here. So you are the Chief Science Officer at ebackmap.com, Food Micro Labs, and Food Safety Solutions, Inc.
Yes.
And before we get started, I wanted to say thank you because you're on the West Coast, and so it's bright and early, 7 a.m. You're in the office. I forced you to drag you in here, so I appreciate you getting up for us.
Happy to do it. When we signed up for the food industry, that's what we all signed up for, right?
Yeah, that's very, very true. So this is the first time Melissa is on here, so everybody say hello to her. And one of the things that we love to do here on the chat, Melissa, is we let everybody know where in the world you're at. And I'm always amazed. We have people from everywhere who check in and join the chat for live conversations. And my goodness, I can't type this morning. I am in Loveland, Colorado, which is a little north of the Denver metro area, where it's hot. Oh my goodness, it's the mid 90s here. Plenty hot. So it looks like Joanne may be flying out from somewhere. Hopefully she's coming back home and not flying out. Allie in San Diego, Ryan's here, Tammy, Megan, great. Cara, of course, great to see everybody here. We have a group of people who come in and join the chat here every week, and I'm super grateful for them. So where in California are you at, Melissa?
I'm in Orange County, so Southern California.
Nice. Yeah, that's a pretty area. I like Orange County. Out in Twin Falls. I like Twin Falls. Pretty town. It's very, very neat.
Yeah, beautiful mountains. Yeah.
And that is kind of one of the things that's kind of cool about the food industry, right? Is it's the plus side of it, right? Is we get to go to all these different places and see all these different things. When you go to production facilities, it kind of tends to be the same areas, right? So the Valley in California and Wisconsin and those type of things. But I got throughout my career, I definitely got to find my way around in those areas of the country for sure. Yeah. Good deal. So like Campbell's in Dubai. Wow. So Dubai is a very interesting town. I've been there myself. So I've been up in the Burj Khalifa, which I still believe is still the tallest building in the world.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So maybe Campbell can verify that for me. So with that, one of the things that we love to do, and people always tease me about this too, Melissa, is one of the things that we do when we start out the chat is we like to share a drink of our favorite beverage. So everyone, please join Melissa and I. I've got coffee, and you said decaf. Boo on the decaf.
Decaf's not good, but when the doctors get involved, you got to do what they say.
Yeah, you got to listen to those guys. So cheers, everyone. And that's nice. And so, my goodness, there is so much to go over here today. So I think we just kind of dive into this. And this is something, Melissa, that we've talked about on the chat before, is environmental monitoring. And how pretty much it seems like companies really have a false sense of security around this. Because what I've seen out there, and I'm curious to get your take on this, is it's same old. People have the same program that they had 10, 15, 20 years ago. And nobody has even updated the environmental sampling map. You ask them about these programs and you go in and consult or things like this, and they dust it off and they show you the same things that they've been doing forever. And I think that's a real false sense of security. Are you kind of seeing the same thing out there as well?
Yes. We see in our laboratory business, we see a lot of companies spending a lot of resources, money on testing, time, And if more so than the expense, it's the strategy. What's the strategy, and are we ahead of our regulators? Are we ahead of it so we know when there are issues? And that's what you're talking about, Bryan. I think reassessing what we're doing to make sure we have the best information, the earliest indicator information, so we can respond and eradicate.
Yeah.
And so looking at it in different ways, I see that in a lot of companies that I work with, there are a lot of great practitioners, high-level scientists that are involved, maintenance, sanitation, operations, all kinds of interaction between people. What I see in firms is sometimes, a lot of times, the most practical, experienced, engaged sanitation manager or maintenance manager, FSQA, whatever, is your best asset, because they'll observe what's going on. They'll bring it to the team. The team's got to listen though. And so sometimes it's hard because you got experts, expert microbiologists, expert FSQA and whatever. And sometimes everybody defers to them, but we've really got to, my experience, the better of a job we do at addressing things and staying fresh and ahead of it is listening.
Oh, that's such a good point, right? Because the experts, we're very able to pontificate and oh yes, but actually, and this is a huge lesson for anybody who works in food safety and quality assurance, is getting out on the floor and observing, right? That's huge. That is huge. And it's always amazing to me because, and we've talked about this on the chat before, Melissa, too, is that the human brain is a filtering instrument. We cannot take in everything that we see in our environment. And kind of, I refer to it as that fresh set of eyes. Just having somebody new in that facility and walking around and going, what's that over there? And it's something that the quality manager walks by every day and just kind of blocked out because they're not paying attention to it. And that's kind of the same thing with FDA. FDA comes in and looks at things with that fresh set of eyes. And so that was kind of the title of our talk here for today is it always seems like even if you have a really aggressive, proactive environmental monitoring program, if FDA comes in and does sampling, they seem to always find stuff. And I think that's a big chunk of it.
Yeah. And I think there's a really good reason for that. And that sometimes we don't understand or don't leverage. When Food and Drug comes in and they do a swab-a-thon, as you know, they're going to come in and collect a lot of surfaces on some unannounced random day. And so their advantage is they've got more money than God, the government, right? And so they can sample a lot of surface areas, way more. The quantity of surface area that they represent in one day is probably far beyond what a routine program involves evaluation of. So right off the bat, they've got an advantage that we don't have, or if we use a strategy as a surveillance type strategy where we're collecting wide surveillance samples to represent areas to know if we've got issues. And I see that when Food and Drug samples, their purpose in collecting all those numerous samples, boatloads of samples, is so they can A, assess the environment, and B, assess the degree of contamination or the numbers of sites where there are issues.
Yeah.
And so their purpose is in finding numbers in places. And if our purpose in a surveillance approach for swabbing isn't to find if we have contamination so we can eradicate it, we can't win that battle unless our company has more money than God, right?
Yeah, and even if they do, right, and this rule has never been violated, is that companies are looking at that bottom line and then looking at that cost per test, and your boss is going, oh, Bryan, you're spending an awful lot here in the budget for environmental monitoring. Can't we cut back on that? Right? We haven't had any positives in a while. Let's do less testing, and that's absolutely the wrong way to go. as we were preparing for the chat here today, and this is something else, and we've talked about this before, and I'm going to go through this and see if there's any new information. But FDA has updated. I was very surprised to see that this morning. Is they have updated their investigations operations manual, so it's now 2023.5, which is pretty much unheard of. FDA normally only updates that manual every 2 or 3 years. And if you're unfamiliar with this, this is pretty much their Bible of how they're going out in the field and doing these type of activities. It's like Brandon is saying here, right? 300 plus swabs, that's what happens. And a key piece of that, Melissa, is that in those instructions is don't tell the plant that you're going to sample. And the other key thing is they want to sample halfway through your production run. So if you're a wet plant and you're producing a product, they want to sample at least 4 hours in the middle of your production run. How many people do that? Normally, sampling takes place after the plant is clean and pretty. And sometimes you even see people that sample after they've applied the sanitizer, which is like, what? Why are you doing that? So FDA is taking a very different approach than how we've done things in the past.
Yeah. They're definitely trying to represent worst case scenario after the spread factor has happened, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a very good operations boss in my past, and we had aggressive environmental monitoring programs. And he said to me, Bryan, if I don't see around 1 to 3% positives for your environmental monitoring program, it means you're not looking hard enough. And he was right. It's there. It is there. So you need to take those things into account. And Duncan makes a very good point here, and good to see you, Duncan, is they feel incentivized food manufacturers to carry out EM monitoring to show good hygienic results. Let me pull up his comment here. I've seen food manufacturers scrub surfaces with sanitizer before swabbing for this purpose. And that's a good point. And I've done this in the past. So I was a microbiologist working in the lab, and we would get environmental sampling programs from our plants, and we would have hits, and they would do their investigation and send their retests in. And to Duncan's point, right, we would open the roll pack bag and it just reeked of sanitizer, right? And you're just like, really, what's the purpose here? What are you really achieving by doing that, right? All you're doing is ticking off a box.
Yeah, I think strategy is everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. So I think part of this too, right, and with our notes on this conversation here today is really kind of level setting relative to how we're having this conversation. So kind of the first question I had for you is what organisms should companies be looking for in the environment, right? You see all kinds of different strategies around this.
Yeah. Well, the answer is not a short answer, right? It really is that it depends on, you really need to risk assess the food. BRC standard and other GFSI, they really focus on risk assessing to identify what those hazards are that need to be controlled through sanitation. And so, I mean, if we look at food and drug and what they're focused on in their investigation operations manual, they're focused on salmonella in dry facilities, low moisture facilities. Unless they're low moisture facilities doing dried milk powder, infant formula, whatever, then they're also interested, obviously, in chronobacter, right? In addition to salmonella. And then in wet plant environment, they're targeting listeria for high moisture foods. Right. And so those, the pathogens of concern really relative to the food, its conditions of use, the safety history of the food, and kind of working backwards is really what that is about. I think, there's a lot of questions about indicators and how do I use indicators, right? And there's indicators, quantitative indicators, really in a program serve a really good purpose, particularly even in low moisture or high moisture, I think, because the quantitative indicators kind of tell us how it is that we're doing, or what's the quantity of cell load on those surfaces relative to groups of organisms that are of interest, right? And if we can understand the quantities of Enterobacteriaceae, EB, on a food contact surface in a low moisture facility in an extrusion operation or pet food or whatever. If we can understand the EB loads on those, particularly zone 1 surfaces, a program design might involve routine swabbing of food contact for EB, so that we can understand if we have, if our management of our environment, of our conditions of running the product, and intervals on cleaning, whether the sum of those are adequate to keep those levels low. Because if those populations of EB become high, the probability that if salmonella is harboring in the environment, that it's a higher risk exists, right? So it's a combination of those quantitative indicators closer to the product stream usually, and
Mm-hmm.
then the pathogen indicators, which in the case of salmonella, you can either, low moisture, you can either run salmonella for the pathogen agent itself, or
Mm-hmm.
there are other, we see other, I'm sure you see too, Brian, and people in the audience see, there are indicators like HTEB, high temperature
Oh,
tolerant
mm-hmm.
Enterobacteriaceae.
Yep,
So
in
that's,
beverages, yeah.
yeah, and that's a subset of Enterobacteriaceae that are H2S positive and that are thermotolerant.
Mm-hmm.
And those, that could tell you, that's not a direct indicator of salmonella, but those organisms are kind of physiologically similar to salmonella. So when they're there, you have an idea that that it might be that the exposure, presence, harborage of the target salmonella is more
Mm-hmm.
probable, right?
No, that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought. I mean, so generally, when you're looking at pathogen testing in the environment, salmonella, listeria, things like this, it's presence or absence. It's there. You found it or you didn't find it. I really like what you're saying relative to the Enterobacter and getting counts and actually seeing how much of that stuff is out there, which is going to give you a good indicator of how effective you are at cleaning. And just to kind of level set for everybody, Enterobacter is kind of this giant family that includes a whole bunch of stuff that we're looking at, and it's an indirect way of testing for pathogens and things of this nature. So you're looking at organisms that have the same growth characteristics within that grouping, that the target organisms that you're looking at are there as well. So it's like within dairy. So the reason the dairy industry looks at coliforms is because it's in the same family, right? So if you don't have coliforms growing in your production, guess what? You're probably not going to have pathogens growing in there either. So it's a nice way to look at things indirectly. But I love what you're saying there around getting those numerical values. It's kind of like almost like it's not a direct correlation. I always hate to make this comparison. Counts do not compare to this, but ATP is okay. How dirty are things relative to your cleaning process? And figuring those things out can give you some good direction on where your team needs to focus.
Yeah. One of the cautions on that, though, is you've got to use them together. When you
Yeah.
have quantitative indicators and you're qualitative for the specific pathogen, if you just use more general indicators and they're quantitative, the sensitivity of the pathogen test, presence, absence, is always much higher.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes people I've seen helped people with issues where they had big FDA problems with FDA or USDA because they were running their quantitative indicators instead of their pathogen presence absence or pathogen
Uh-huh.
indicators. And the sensitivity of the testing is totally different. And so
Mm-hmm.
you could have low EB counts and salmonella could salmonella could still be there. You could
Yeah.
have high EB counts, and the probability it would be there would be higher, but there's no direct correlation. And so you've got to kind of use a strategy where both are involved. So you have places to go where where, for example, in a extrusion operation, enrobing operation after extrusion on cereals and things, where there are steps in the process where there are temperature gradients, steam gets generated, whatever. And so the conditions for growth exist, and making sure that the cleaning intervals and methodology controls numbers adequately will help control, obviously, pathogen.
Yeah.
So,
No, that's a good point. And it also comes down to sample size as well. So if you are looking at a 25-gram sample out of an entire production run for salmonella, odds are you aren't going to find it. And that, I think that's why it's always important too, as technical people working in this field, is being able to communicate this information outside of our circle as well, because we've all had those conversations with operations and things like this who don't understand what you're talking about, and they will, oh well, it's negative test results, everything is fine. It's like, maybe all that really means, right? Which is why I always like to use terminology like we didn't find it, right? They take negative and they mean everything is negative. Well, no, not necessarily. So let's see. Ryan had a question for us here. Keep the questions coming, guys. This is a great opportunity here with Melissa. So older plants with poor flooring and other issues struggle the most. How do we effectively communicate to implant maintenance and leadership to get the capital? Oh, yes. Good question, Ryan. What are your thoughts around that, Melissa?
Well, I have boatloads of case studies of issues that I've worked on to help people in those sorts of circumstances, where we wipe the names off in industry, right? We know that. It doesn't really matter what the name is. It's all about what the issue they went through and how did they recognize it, how did they solve it, what did it cost them. And so I always love to use case study examples of disasters, because we're in a spot, and that's a great question, Brennan. We're in a spot where we always have to be almost in a mode where we're doing the Winston tire evaluation equation. What could disaster cost us? And a lot of times, if we haven't gone through a disaster in our firms, it's hard to justify that. Well, that's never happened to us. And until anybody on your team has been through the wars and experienced that, then they know how bad it can be. And that personal experience, I think, is so valuable to help convey it to senior management and to the company as far as risk goes. But that's try and quantify it as best you can. I like to use TQM strategy tools, figuring out what is the price of nonconformance. How could we estimate in dollars and cents what this could cost us if we don't? And then with EBAC-MAP, with our environmental pathogen software mapping, tracking, trending, and when senior management can visualize and see where the contamination is, and see interactive movies that show how the contamination is spreading in the environment and where, that is really a powerful tool to add to the price of nonconformance and estimates of, okay, we know what reports of recalls are in industry and what they cost. And so kind of coupling those things together, I think visual tools are something they can see and understand, changes everything, whether it's decision making. That's what we have found. And as to your point, Bryan, when we just started talking, you said, the human brain takes in information, and it's we have to limit ourselves in what we can take in. But one of the things with a visual tool is your brain takes in visual information tens of thousands of times faster and better when it's a visual input than auditory or reading, right? Or image.
Oh, and that's that's a whole nother topic, right? Because people taking information differently. There's visual people and auditory people and these type of things too. But to your point overall is, anytime you can take this information out of the abstract and make it more concrete, the better it's going to be. If the vice president of operations is looking at the environmental monitoring report and it's just a series of numbers on a page, okay, fine, right? But if they can actually see where that contamination is, and then they can extrapolate the potential damage from that only helps.
Yeah, yeah. One of the other strategies too that I find is a lot of times it's numbers on a page, like you're talking about, Brian, vice president of operations, it's the president of the company, it's whomever, and when they see that, oh, it's just listeria, it's not. Well, if you actually, I like to remind people what that organism, illness, injury, death associated with that organism potentially, and sometimes we tend to forget that we
Yeah,
don't, it's not top of mind because we have so many things in our universe, I think, considerations, and so that's helpful too, is okay, what happens to people if we get this wrong. Okay.
exactly. Yeah, and yeah, it's and that's an excellent point. I want to reemphasize that. People, right? This is all about people. And that's something, Melissa, that we talk about here on the chat quite a bit, right? There's all this technical information that we have, but the people side of it, we need to make sure that we're bringing it to that point. And these type of issues, like we saw with the recent Netflix documentary Poisoned with Darren Detweiler and other people in that, if there's an illness and a tragedy, there's always people behind that. And we need to remind everyone of that occasionally.
Yeah.
Campbell had a very specific question here. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer this, but we'll fire it up here. Keep them coming, guys. These are great. Is it okay to release the line on Enterobacter results after a positive Salmonella result in Zone 3? Ooh.
Well, that depends. This is the worst answer, right, Campbell? It depends. But the question is, what is EB counts are often can often be elevated on food contact surface because it's such a wide indicator. So
Yeah.
the question is, where did that zone 3 salmonella hit occur? What's the history in the facility? And that salmonella finding, because salmonella doesn't occur as widely in nature as listeria does, for example, if we've got salmonella occurrence in zone 3 in a high risk area, relative to product, that might be, if the EB counts are high, and we got salmonella zone 3, we might want to do more investigation of finished product testing, for example. If that salmonella result is unusual or unexpected,
Mm-hmm.
um, we might want to do more work to understand whether there has been exposure to the product and what kind of potential for problem there is. So
Yeah. Well, and kind of overall as a theoretical point on this, and again, Campbell, sorry we can't answer specifically. If you want, reach out to either of us, right? We have our emails here. We can hopefully provide some additional assistance offline of the specifics of what you're looking at. But any type of a good quality system program, you want to try and get everything in that predictive mode as much as you can. So what do I mean by that? When you're looking at environmental monitoring, you're looking at large groups or families of organisms, you're hopefully what you're trying to do is find things before they become that pathogenic risk. So if you're looking in the environment, you're being very aggressive and saying, oh, we're seeing some growth and some trends in these areas, we need to really proactively step up our efforts to keep it from progressing farther down that line. It's kind of like the example I use is pest control. You know, for example, in the fall, if you're in a rural area, if it's getting cold outside, that those rodents that are living out in the woods and out in the cornfields and things like that, they're going to get cold, right? And they're going to see your plant and go, ooh, that's a nice warm place, right? So you should be thinking about that in advance and saying to your pest control operator, we need to add some additional traps, some additional inspections as we're going into the fall to keep those things from happening. So it's really kind of the same way there. So we've got some terminology going on and people have questions relative to this. But before we dive into Austin and Megan's question here, I'd see your comments here, guys, is the zone model, right? Which really hasn't changed. So we have people referencing the zones, Melissa. So just so that we're all on the same page, what are these different zones?
Well, that depends on what your definition of them are. A lot of people base their definitions on what the regulatory definitions are,
Mhm.
which I think is wise. If you're an FDA facility, the traditional zones 1, 2, 3, and 4, zone 1, food contact, or a surface where contamination can drip, drain, or be drawn into the product stream that can affect the food. Zone 2, adjacent to food contact. Zone 3, in the exposed product room, but remote from zone 2. And zone 4 is outside, other GMP areas, general GMP areas, lower risk areas. And that's usually what people define. But a lot of people go in and make uh, more specifically define zone 2 as adjacent.
Hmm.
And an example of that, slide, that I have a slide
Yeah.
with a piece of equipment. I figure we might have a question, and so if you hit the next one, hit the next one. Okay, yeah. So a lot of people on this type of equipment, this is like a piece of a cooker piece of equipment, and these a lot. Some people define everything that's not food contact on that piece of equipment. Food's running through the inside. Everything that's not food contact is zone 2. And that's a very conservative way to do that, because it does include, as you can see down there, the footings,
Yeah.
the footings, undercarriage frame footings, everything not except food contact or what's above it for potential for drip, drain, or be drawn into the product stream. So that's a
Right.
super conservative definition of zone 2. But when you use it for your surveillance, it's amazing. However, when a regulator comes in and says, "Oh my God, you got hits on zone 2,"
Uh-huh.
and they object to it, and your zone 2 is very conservative, they're not thinking about that. They're just looking at, you've got adjacent incidents, pathogen or pathogen indicator on adjacent, and that's not good. So in this case, if we had a conservative zone 2, which was undercarriage, frame, footing, everything non-food contact, as a 2, and then
Uh-huh.
three is floors, drains, transfer devices, all that kind of stuff, right? That's remote from that doesn't specifically process exposed food.
Right.
So what a lot of people do when there's that kind of environment or concern is they'll take zone 2 is everything in this picture, everything adjacent within the a couple of feet of the opening beneath and around the side there. And
Uh-huh.
then zone 3 is everything from the floor up to some level, a foot, knee level, whatever. That they consider then as zone 3, less conservatively. And so then the probability of hits, as we know, I'm sure we would all agree, is so much higher as we approach or get closer to the floors.
Yeah.
And so in that way, we can uh, uh, not get agency hackles up, still know the answer to the question, and give us the chance to address it.
Yeah, exactly. And so part of this too, right? In this picture is something I always a good example I always use for zone 2 is like, and you see on this machine here, there's like an emergency stop and things like this. Anything that the worker is pushing, right? Because a lot of times you will see in plants, you have these PLC panels and things like that that's running this piece of equipment that the operator is constantly doing this all day long. Then when the sanitation shift comes up, Melissa, what sanitation do, right? They put a big piece of plastic over that because they can't get it wet.
Yeah.
Okay, well, everything that's hanging out on that piece of equipment stays there. And FDA loves to sample those, loves, loves, loves. And this picture too is a great example of the importance of sanitary design. And we've had Alan Saylor on here before talking about this as well. Those feet, like you see on this machine like that, with those flat plates that just sit on the floor. Oh God, those are horrible. What
Yeah.
is underneath those? Right? What is under those things?
Oh,
Oof.
yeah.
And as we're looking at these slides, you made a really good point here too, is a lot of times is your sampling schedule, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And if when FDA comes in, it's conceivable they would take 13 samples of that piece of equipment, because again,
Yeah.
they're trying to understand where contamination exists and at what rate. And they've got more money than God. They'll take potentially this many samples in one day.
Yeah.
And so if you there's so their chance of finding something, if you go to the next image, If we have one place on the equipment that was problem, and they've come in and sampled that many samples in one day, their probability of finding it is way higher than ours. If in industry, we often use a rotation approach for sampling.
Hmm.
And that can work, but if we're sampling very small localized surface areas like this, it may take, and we do 1 to 2 swabs a week, it may take us 6.5 to 13 weeks to even represent all those sites in totality.
Hmm.
And then how they're changing and shifting over that 6.5 to 13 weeks, and more might develop, is a problem, right? And
Yeah.
so the advantage, when your first question, Brian, about what should we do, if you look at the next slide, when I talked about a wide surveillance approach using our conservative zone 2 definition, if I were to once a week swab a composite representing all of my conservative zone 2, then I would have utter confidence that when the agency comes in, that they're not going to find anything, and that more importantly, the hygiene of that equipment is in control, and I don't have a pathogen issue.
Yeah.
You could draw this same uh, uh, composite scheme with your less conservative zone 2, but then you'd have to have a separate one for zone
Hmm.
3.
Yeah.
What
And I mean, there's just so much you said right there. So I need to break that down a little bit for myself. Is number one, guys, look at kind of what she is saying here relative to zone sampling, because in the past it's always been zone 3 and zone 4, and oh my God, never go near a 1 or 2. That has radically changed, and FDA is sampling those areas. You need to be looking at those too. And the other piece here is the composite approach, which is fantastic. I love this. If there's one thing that we can take away from our chat here today, is you really need to look at that from that standpoint, because, oh, well, no, I need to know exactly where that hit was. I mean, do you? In this particular example, so we've got this piece of equipment, we've done a composite sample, we've taken samples from all these different little blue squares here within this. And like in the previous example, right, that guy right there was the cause. But what am I really concerned about? I'm concerned about that this piece of equipment is contaminated, right? So I have that hit, it comes back as part of that composite. Now I'm going through and tearing that sucker down, and I am cleaning and I am stripping equipment down, because remember, again, like we talk about here as well, is equipment 9 times out of 10 is manufactured and designed for production efficiency, not cleanability. Right? So there's always going to be little hidden gremlins in there in areas that don't get cleaned most times. So now you know from your composite, because you're able to look at a wider swath, something on that machine wasn't cleaned correctly. So now you go back and you do your intensive process to figure out what the heck is going on. And now you could potentially, Melissa, go back and now pull a bunch of individual samples to see where it was coming from.
Right. Yeah. So the surveillance approach, this wide composite surveillance approach for zones 2 and 3 and 4, is really intended to tell you if contamination exists, which is what I heard you saying, Brian, to tell you if it exists there.
Yeah.
Because if it doesn't, you have great confidence that it doesn't. If it does, we do our corrective action. We determine if it's there, why, if we removed it. And if not, then we go in and do localized samples to determine where.
Yeah.
And that strategy, when Food and Drug, every firm I've worked with on disasters where FDA has come in and found drastically different pathogen incidents in their environment after a swab-a-thon than the firm has. In every instance, in some form or another, the firm asks FDA, well, we have a sampling plan. We spend X amount of $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a month on this. What are we doing wrong? And they say what FDA says. If you've got this, what FDA says, regardless, is you're not sampling enough. And what and if you use FDA's strategy, because they're trying to find where contamination is and how much, and they have more money than God. So what they're really saying is, not that you don't sample enough, it's that you don't represent enough.
Mm.
And in industry, if we represent more, we don't have to increase our spend on environmental pathogen monitoring greatly if we have good confidence that there's not contamination there. And that's what a true surveillance approach really is.
That's
And
a fantastic observation. Very good. So get the most bang for your buck.
yes, yes. Yes, and one of our businesses is a contract, ISO accredited contract food testing lab, and we do thousands of Listeria and Salmonella tests a day.
Mhm.
And I'm telling you, test fewer samples, represent surfaces that are not food contact more widely, so you have better information to determine where, if contamination exists, and then you can go in and knock it in the head like you're talking about. Right.
Exactly. And there's a subtle message in there that sometimes will screw up companies too, is why are you doing this? You are doing this to root out and find potential contamination in your manufacturing facility. It is not to have a good result on your KPI so that you can get your bonus at the end of the year, right? That, and sometimes companies get lost in that, right? And it's like, oh my God, you had hits, and what are you doing wrong? It's like, actually, that should be good, right? We found something good. Let's go and figure out why. Right? Burying your head in the sand never works.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I will say this. After Food and Drug comes in, or even USDA comes in and does investigation, IVT, the degree of sampling, you mentioned it earlier, Brian, that what happens is you tend to do a lot more samples because you've got to determine if it's in control or not. And that excessive numbers of samples, numbers of tests are not sustainable.
Mhm.
And so we got to, in industry, I would much rather see us every week do a zone 2 composite on this piece of equipment, and a zone 3 if we've broken up zone 2 and zone 3. I'd much rather see that on a more frequent basis that's representative of more, and so we have good confidence, than to see these rotated around and sampling a lot more and doing a lot more tests and not being able to sustain that because the budget, the time
Mhm.
necessary, right, for sampling and management of samples and all that stuff. That's right. Like I'm sure everybody on probably agrees with that, right?
Yeah, and that's something as food safety professionals, it's very important to teach in your organization, which is chemistry testing, pH and salt and whatever else is very different than microbiological testing. Micro is a statistical game, right? You're trying to find that needle in a haystack, and in order to do that, as anybody who looks at statistics knows, you need large sample sizes. So you need to be able, and that's why I like this approach so much, is you're able now, instead of doing one sample. So in this picture, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, over 12, 13 samples that are now being composited into that. You've just now increased your visibility into the sanitation and environmental monitoring for this machine 13-fold, just with the same output associated with that from a testing standpoint. So that's huge. There was a couple questions here, and apologies about this, guys, because sometimes within any business, right, you tend to fall into the vernacular. So somebody asked here, what's TQM mean?
Oh, sorry. Total quality management.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Austin here was also curious about your evaluation tool that you mentioned earlier, Winston Tire evaluation. I don't think that was it, but what was it?
Winston Tire equation.
Equation.
That was made famous in business arenas. Remember when there were faults in Winston
Oh yes.
tires, and it's like, okay, how much can we bear? How many deaths would it be? How much was it going to cost us how much it's going to cost us to defend that versus recalling all of our tires and replacing them? What's it going to cost?
Gotcha.
for
And I remember, yeah. So I remember Firestone and the tires that were blowing out, and Ford was blaming Firestone, and Firestone was blaming Ford. And I remember there was a picture of the plant outside, and there was this big banner on this Firestone plant that said ISO 9001 certified. And I'm like, okay, well, programs aren't any good unless they actually get you where you need to go. So
Yeah,
that was a huge,
I
huge issue with
apologize.
that.
I might have said Winston, Firestone. Remember, brand doesn't matter who it could affect, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay, definitely. So, and one of the things that I had mentioned earlier here, is there another slide here? I think there is, right? No, that's it. Okay. Um, is that the sampling program, right? Also, the other piece here that we didn't mention as well is who's doing the sampling and are they properly trained? Do they know how to take samples? Are you using swabs versus sponges? What type of a neutralizing broth are you using, right? Because your whole goal with this is once you take that sample is to put that organism in a nice little environment that's going to hopefully keep it around until we can get it over to your lab and do some testing. So I've seen this in the past, right, where you actually go out and you observe sampling technique, and you'll see the technician who's going to go out and they've got their swab and they do this, boop, right, and you're like, no, no, right. So with that example of that machine with those blue boxes, I love that because really what you're doing with that sponge, right, is you're at least a 4x4 inch square, and you need to be aggressive in that.
Oh yeah. Well, what that meant, I didn't explain it super well. That big
Oh, the
trace
yellow.
around the perimeter is
Uh-huh.
the entirety. The swab is taking the entirety of the sides,
Hmm.
the undercarriage, all those
Ah.
surfaces. So it's really important, to your point, Bryan, as far as sampling, when you're taking a large composite like this, that you make sure that your neutralizer doesn't run out. Don't let the swab go dry, because
Hmm.
if it hits any sanitizer, it may affect the test and inactivate the organism. So you can
Yeah.
composite multiple sponges or swabs into the same bag for the same analytical test. The general convention is not more than 5,
Uh-huh.
but you probably wouldn't need more than 5 for that. You probably might need a couple or a few, depending on how dry it is or whatever. But yeah, the sampling is everything, and those are undercarriage frame and footing, and so you're dragging the swab along the underside, where gravity will draw contaminant, will droplet and drain from surfaces spatially above, right?
Yeah.
And so if we're representing those lower surfaces and all those zone twos widely, we have really good confidence on a
Hmm.
composite.
And as I was quickly scanning through the new investigations operation manual, I saw in there, I need to go back and read this some more in section 4, is they were talking about how to pull in process samples from different parts of the manufacturing process for evaluation for pathogens.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So as we look at that piece of machinery, FDA could be going into that and pulling in process samples. So you need to understand that and how you react to that. So more to come on that, which kind of gets you to our next question, right? So we're kind of designing all these type of things. Really, Melissa, what should your program look like? We've been talking about zones and things like this. Can we kind of walk through that real quick?
Well, yes. One of the commonest questions on design is, do I need to swab zone ones? Do I need to
Uh-huh.
swab operational zone 1? And the answer is yes, you do. You must. And the reason is, if you don't, and you find positives for whichever target pathogen you're looking for in other zones, when Food and Drug or USDA, USDA mandates in the Listeria rule, food contact operational. So that's, they already mandate that. So let's talk FDA. FDA, if we find environmental positives in exposed product handling room, ready to eat product,
Mhm.
and you don't have zone 1 sampling, they're going to press you on the, they're going to press you to demonstrate that that food was not adulterated, that the
Yes.
contaminant didn't reach zone 1. And if you don't have zone 1 testing at some frequency, then they may They chase you into a corner effectively,
Yeah.
on the basis that the food may have been packed, held, or processed under conditions wherein it may have become adulterated, because you
Hmm.
don't have evidence that that zone 1 wasn't affected. And that's why in their guidance, I would, as far as what should be in the program, I would follow the FDA guidance on that. Their Listeria guidance
Hmm.
is a great guidance tool, and it does state that when you swab different zones within an exposed product area, that you should have zone 1 represented, so that for the very reason that I talked about, so that you could
Yeah.
demonstrate it wasn't affected. Now, do you have to do that every time you swab zones 2 and 3? Not necessarily. But if there's some kind of problem indicated and you're seeing increased findings with environmental pathogen in zone, or repeat
Hmm.
findings in zones 2 or 3, then zone 1 should be rolled in there, so that you have that data in your pocket and you have some basis for saying we don't have evidence that food contact was affected.
Yeah.
Does you in your program, in the FDA guidance, it specifically says that you need to have criteria defined for when food testing, finished product testing, or in process testing needs to be done.
Yeah.
And so if your results indicate that, your program needs to define when finished product testing would be triggered, under what
Hmm.
circumstances, and all that.
Excellent. Wow. Well, that's fantastic points. So let me kind of unpack that. So number one is FDA is saying you have to prove to us you're okay. The standard environmental monitoring approach that we've used in the past, which is this, right, is like, okay, I'll do some zone 3 and zone 4, but I'm never, ever, ever going to look at anything that even comes close to product. FDA is saying, nope, not good enough, right? And the other piece is, and I think this is really brilliant and insightful, is you need to have an escalation program. So generally, the escalation doesn't go beyond vector analysis. It's like, oh, I had a hit. I'll go out and I'll do some additional sampling around that, and I'll do some swabbing of forklift wheels or whatever, and I'll clean the snot out of that area and spray a bunch of sanitizer around and retest, and yay, I've solved. My problem has gone away. I like what you're saying in that it's like, no, if you're starting to see, and this is where tools I think like with eBac Map can help and things like this, is if you're starting to see these little warning indicators, that probably means that you need to increase your program, right? You need to bring it up to DEFCON 2, right? So you were at DEFCON 3, now you're at DEFCON 2. It's like, all right, we need to start doing some more intensive sampling and really start zeroing in on these areas. And it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, is that those fresh eyes and looking at these things, and not looking at your environmental monitoring program like some mechanism that you ritualistically go through every quarter or whatever. And that if it's negative, then okay, everything is all good.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the other cautions on as far as zone 1 testing is that I've worked with firms, many firms in the United States and elsewhere, that are importing into the United States. So they're under FDA rule.
Yeah.
And if your program involves zones 2 and 3 and 4 and finished product testing instead of zone 1 testing, the agency will not accept finished product testing as sufficing for zone 1 testing that
Mm.
gives direct evidence about food contact surfaces in the high risk areas. So it's follow that guidance. It talks about sampling frequency, swabbing plan, defining that, corrective actions, defining them, triggers for finished product testing, handling recurring pathogen findings versus incidental findings that are not recurrent. It talks about training. It talks about swabbing methodology definition. It talks
Mhm.
about valid test method usage that's fit for purpose and approved for that. Defining your surface area quantities, um,
Wow.
all manner of things. It's really
Yeah, so
good.
the resources are out there. And as you guys can tell here, Melissa, a wealth of information. And I'm going to be posting all this information in the food safety chat database website with all that there as well. So that's going to all be available there too. So, oh boy, I mean, so we're just barely scratching the surface here, right? So vector analysis, your corrective actions. And so part of what's implied in this conversation, but we haven't mentioned specifically, which is, remember, under FSMA, your environmental monitoring program for ready-to-eat foods is an open book. Right? So FDA has full rights to look at that information. So if you have recurring hits in an area and every quarter comes up again, comes up again, FDA is going to be pushing you on that and saying, okay, why aren't you figuring out where this is coming from and why aren't you fixing this? And that may result in a 43.
Yeah, yeah. Most firms, probably everybody on here, most firms really focus hard and respond hard, aggressively to individual nonconformance findings. If you find a salmonella, or you find a Listeria genus, there's shoot to kill, right?
Yeah.
Figure it out, remedy it, do your follow-up swabs, whatever. But what's missing in a lot of firms, and FDA capitalizes on this, and they stress this in the rule making, is problem with recurrence of
Yeah.
findings. And so what that means is that the thing that is really hard to do is to consider the results in their aggregate and what they might mean as far as the needs for investigation, root cause analysis, corrective action. We, as an industry, it's phenomenal what kind of crash teams work on each nonconformance and the aggressive nature of that. But then we correct that, and then we don't look at the aggregate of those results with other results that might be related to it, downstream, upstream, adjacent, next room over, operational relationships, and the aggregate of data and results are, I think, the thing that is the hardest to do, and that's what our EBAC map, what the visual tool is aimed at,
Yeah.
is demonstrating that. And so any tool, you can use a paper map, and for decades, you Bryan, you probably did paper maps, right? Where you and I think that however we're going to do it, whatever tools we use, make sure that we do consider the aggregate of data, the trends with data, recurrences by site and recurrences by zone, and trending and tracking by zone and by site.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because you have to look at this and say, okay, well, we had this environmental hit in this area. Let's say it's a high traffic area where a lot of employees walk through all the time. Right? Where's that going to? Right? Bacteria love to hitch rides, and so or that thing that drives everybody nuts in food safety is that employee using that hose, right, and spraying down the floor, and you see this giant plume of aerosol going everywhere, and you're just like, oh my God, no, never do that again, please. And they're like, what? Right? And they're like, no, don't do that. So, gosh, part of this is, and this is a bummer because we're running out of time here, Melissa and I. There's so much more I want to talk about, but we're out of time here. So let's bring this back up to the 30,000 foot level and kind of summarize here for everybody. So what are some of the key messages or learnings you'd like to give to people here today?
Key messages, learnings. Decide your strategy. Use a wide surveillance approach where you can to give you the best confidence and control. When you do that, as you roll that out, or if you aren't doing that currently, when you roll it out piece of equipment by piece of equipment. So because the sanitation team and the maintenance team are going to need to bear down for that. If that level of stringency on sampling hasn't been in place, than historically, then there we might find hits that you've not ever recognized before because of rotation uh, strategies, or all those sample sites weren't even traditionally, historically sampled. So
Yeah.
really look at your strategy. As you said, Bryan, training, be inclusive. My top recommendation is, and I'm sure everybody would agree, get that maintenance and sanitation team
Oh,
involved. Put visuals in front of everybody: senior
mhm.
management, ownership, FSQA, senior leadership, the techs, the sanitors, everybody. There's much visual tools that you can use so that you can get their engagement and feedback. All they need to be doing is sitting there and go, oh yeah, every time I take that control panel off, there's a slimy product that runs down the back of it inside. And you don't know that. They don't know that
Yeah,
that's relevant. And oh, it's closed. It doesn't touch the food. It's fine. So engaging them is where I think all of the advantages. And we're trying to take
absolutely.
advantages and be practical. And that's what I would recommend. Be inclusive and
Yep, I love it. Food safety is a team activity, right? And you need to involve everybody. Don't feel like you just need to hold on to this yourself. So, guys, I would imagine, I would imagine there's tons of questions and things like that. So, of course, I'm available. Melissa's email's there; she's available as well. Fantastic information. Of course, as I mentioned here, so within the new food safety chat online course database, all this information, there's other stuff here that Melissa supplied as well that we weren't able to get to. So tons of material out there for that. Guys, any upcoming activities, Melissa, or things that you guys are doing that you want anybody to know about really quickly before we close out?
Uh, I think well, we have an integration on eBackMap.
Mhm.
We're in the process of, by next month, rolling out an API, so
Oh,
that with Charm, with their ATP system. So coupling in ATP results and nonconformances against environmental pathogen nonconformance results, and then
ooh,
quantitative microbial indicators. When you start overlaying those to see where those nonconformances are, that is amazing, because relating them in the past has been difficult. And
yeah,
so
no,
that's something new we have coming up with the Charm ATP
love
system.
it, love it.
And
Great.
and in the future, we're going to integrate some AI, some machine learning,
Hmm.
some predictive stuff. So that's what's in our plans. But right now is all of the 3D, 3D mapping,
Uh-huh.
3 dimension, like you're there. Movies, so you can see progressive spread throughout your map, your environment.
Ooh.
There's a lot of features like that in eBackMap that
Mhm.
are part of our subjects of our patent, that are really cool for teams to be able to understand.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, with that, we're going to have to close out the chat here for today. And everyone, thank you, Mohammed, everyone here on the chat, Kara. Wow, what a fire hose of information here today. So definitely, Melissa, we're going to have you back on the chat. So happy we were able to have you on today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for asking me, Bryan. I really appreciate it. And to everybody, I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful weekend, and strategy is everything. And I know you are the strategists of the world. That's what I
Absolutely.
know. Yeah.
Yep. So we will see everybody back here next Friday for the next food safety chat. So the same time, 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and we'll have another expert like Melissa on the show to talk about a new topic. So in the meantime, enjoy your weekend, have a great time, and we will see you back here next Friday. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you. Bye bye.